American reporter goes to Venezuela, comes back with the story of a lifetime, but not the one she expected to tell. Hi, this is Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. Well, Hannah Dreier, an Associated Press reporter, back in 2014 went to Venezuela, half convinced that the media was conspiring to tell a false tale about the regime of Nicolas Maduro, who was the successor to Hugo Chavez, the famous socialist dictator of Venezuela. She was convinced that things couldn't be half as bad as the media was saying it was, and in fact, she moved into a neighborhood where things seemed to be doing pretty well. There's lots of arts, lots of entertainment, lots of wealthy people. In fact, the biggest problem that her neighbors and friends down there seemed to suffer was from an epidemic of obesity, because they were just eating all the time and there were plenty to go around for everybody. Well, that was then. A year later, she starts noticing things like her friends seem to have lost 10 to 15 pounds, and more of her friends and associates were telling stories about being mugged or robbed or having their houses burglarized. Eventually, she was mugged in broad daylight by two guys on a motorcycle who just drove up and robbed her. Her friends kind of laughed it off and said, "Oh yeah, that's kind of a good robbery because nobody got hurt." Little by little, she watched, in her mind anyway, Venezuela descend into a hellish dog-eat-dog kind of existence where people were, beating up other people in the streets because they butted in line to pick through the garbage. Well, this is a tale that is familiar to anybody who's ever studied history and seen what happens when socialism takes hold. But it was apparently a surprise to this journalist. And I just thought it was a cautionary tale. And this woman's, by the way, the takeaway, when Hannah Dreier came back, she said her takeaway from it is that when you think things can't get any worse, when you think that certainly now things have gotten as bad as they can get and change will have to happen, you're wrong. Ugh. Things can always get worse. Stephen Green, is it just the naivete of an idealistic journalist going to Venezuela that she might think that things couldn't be that bad, and if they were, they couldn't get any worse, or is there something else at work here?
Well, the definition of a conservative is a liberal who's been mugged by a socialist. All I can say to this lovely lady is welcome to the club. I'm not going to indulge in any "I told you so's" or any of that. I'm sorry she had to witness what she did. I hope she keeps telling the truth about it. Look, the fact is, socialism always feels good at first. There really is more the wealth being spread around. There's more. There is more food being spread around. What they don't tell you is that it feels that way because they're feeding you the seed corn for next year's harvest. That's why it always ends in starvation. Sometimes accidentally, because they're eating the seed corn. Sometimes on purpose, like Stalin's forced famine in the Ukraine, because they lock up the seed corn and don't let the enemies of the people eat. But one way or another, this is where socialism leads every single time. And I don't mean social welfare states like Denmark or Norway or Sweden or any of that. That's a capitalist society with a huge welfare state bolted on top. And capitalism can produce an awful lot of excess wealth, to borrow a phrase of Marx's that I hate. It can create enough wealth to sustain a really huge welfare state. So let's not conflate socialism with welfare spending. They're two entirely different things. That said, here's my fear going forward as Venezuela approaches its inevitable collapse and all the hardship, misery, and death that's going to bring. But, the left, when they were done lionizing Stalin after Khrushchev denounced him in the mid-1950s, and that leaked out to the West, the leftists in this country and in the West couldn't defend Stalin any longer. It became politically impossible to do when even the Communist Party of the Soviet Union wasn't defending him any longer. But instead what they did was they started to portray Stalin as the brute who sold out Lenin's noble revolution for the people. And I have the feeling that's what is going to happen with Maduro and Chavez. Chavez is going to become the Lenin to Maduro's Stalin. Maduro is the bad guy who ruined the beautiful socialist experiment that Chavez brought to the people, when in fact he's the inevitable result of Chavezism.
Well, and Steve, Hannah Dreier found exactly that when she talks to people on the streets, or when she was still there, she talked to people on the streets, and she would find that people would actually tear up at the mention of Hugo Chavez's name. He is still lionized. He's still hailed as practically a god man. And,
so it's happening already.
And that they're disappointed that, Nicolas Maduro has sort of, dropped the ball on the great society that young Chavez was creating. Now, Bill Whittle, Hannah Dreier said something that was really telling. She said, in 2015, I no longer had to go out to find the impact of what was happening in Venezuela. I only needed to look out my window where there was a lynching going on in the street. It came home to her. It came to an upper middle class neighborhood that she had specifically moved into for the security that it provided. And now it was on her doorstep. The exchange rate used to be officially at that time was 10 bolivars per US dollar, but on the black market it was 10,000. When she walked to a restaurant to get something to eat, she would literally carry a shopping bag with bundles of bolivars and would hand it to the waiter. The waiter wouldn't even count it. They didn't have time. They could not have possibly counted all the money. And so the thing is utterly broken down. The whole society, and the murder rate is through the roof. But here's the thing. Their number one source of income in Venezuela is petroleum products. Petroleum, and their biggest customer for petroleum is the United States of America. Now, President Trump has said he's personally cutting off Maduro's personal wealth overseas to the extent that the U.S. has control over that. But we're still pumping money into Venezuela. If we do that, we prop up Maduro. If we don't, people could starve even more. What's the right thing to do here, Bill?
You would want to say we should assist the people of Venezuela, but from the story, sounds like Ms. Dreier, as an individual in the society in general, that there are none as blind as those who will not see. When she wrote the story, Scott, did she ever mention that socialism had destroyed Venezuela and she watched it happen? Did she ever say that?
Yeah, she got around to that. But at the beginning, she said she was just kind of putting out dry reports, but she said they weren't getting picked up by the U.S. media. So instead of saying things about statistics about starvation and stuff like that, she started telling individual stories. The girl who goes to the hospital because she skinned her knee, but she can't get antibiotics and winds up dying as a result of it. But those got traction.
I don't think that in any of these anybody really made the case that this is the inevitable result of socialism and that Venezuela, given its tremendous petroleum resources, could have been the richest country in the hemisphere south of the U.S. border, but instead is the poorest. Average Venezuelans have lost 18 pounds. They've gone into the zoos, broken into the zoos to kill the zoo animals for food. So obviously, we can draw some conclusions from this, that socialism works beautifully. It's just that the Venezuelans didn't do it right. And it turns out that the Nicaraguans didn't do it right either. And the Cubans didn't do it right. And the Vietnamese didn't do it right. And the Cambodians didn't do it right. And the Chinese didn't do it right.
I'm sensing a trend here, right. Bill.
And not only did it result in catastrophe, but it results in murder because they're not doing it right. Just as a very quick point to Steve, what Steve said about Stalin and the perception that Stalin ruined Lenin's, perfect revolution. The Cheka, which became the secret police, the execution of people who were known to be innocent, show trials, enforced starvation, lying to the international community. These are all Lenin's direct orders. Lenin created the state that Stalin took over. So let me just say this, because I think that the thing here is, why are people just unable to learn this lesson? I read a very interesting book about Stalin, a very detailed book about Stalin. And by the way, it looks like the most dangerous occupation in all of history was to be related to Joseph Stalin in any way, shape, or form. He closed this book with a brief line from a woman, and I'm doing this from memory, but it is very, very close to what I'm about to say. This woman said, well, the system killed my husband, took out and shot, killed my husband, killed 2 of my sons, killed 2 of my brothers, killed all of my grandchildren, my aunt, my mother, and my sister. But yet I still believe in it. And she's serious. She's not joking around. Yeah. She does still believe in it. She does still believe in it. What do you say to people like that? There's something wrong with them. What do you say to somebody like that who simply can't learn the lesson? And as you were pointing out, Steve, it became impolitic to support Stalin. So one of the people that they supported was Castro. See, Castro, unlike Stalin, he just shot a few people. He didn't mass murder anybody. And he's a simple man of the people, Fidel Castro. And you can tell he's a simple man of the people because you always see him in the same green tunic. I don't want to run this super long, but let me just say two things. First of all, when Fidel Castro died, he had $800 million in his personal bank account, which is not bad for being a man of the people who never really worked in terms of creating anything for his people. But I had some friends who went down to Cuba. So here's how socialism works, folks. They went down and spoke to a cab driver. They were assigned a cab driver. He was with them 24 hours a day. This is what happens today in Cuba, not 20 years ago. This is what happens today. In order to drive a cab, this man has to buy a permit from the government. That permit costs $3,000 a month. And if he doesn't pay $3,000 a month to the Castros, he loses his permit and he's not able to work anymore. Now, because it's a socialist country, the Cuban government does provide him with a monthly salary. And that monthly salary for everybody is $50 a month. But as a cab driver, it goes to $100 a month. So he gets $50 to $100 a month, like every other Cuban citizen, from the government. But he has to pay the government $3,000 US per month in order to drive a cab. That money goes to Castro so Fidel can die with $800 million. Now, you would think, why would somebody do that? Because this man has to work. He has to work 20-hour days every day. He takes Sunday off. He has to work 20 hours a day to keep making enough money to continue to buy that license. Well, he works that way because it's a better life than the alternative. That's socialism. That's the reality of socialism. And if you're one of these liberal people who look at, as Steve said, look at socialism as a great idea, what you're doing is you are talking about butchering the calf of capitalism, having yourself a fine old feast, and then being left with nothing but bones and wondering what happened. And gee, I had no idea, and I guess they didn't do it right.
Hey, Scott, can I throw in one more thing that Bill?
Yes, please do.
Or no, you reminded me of this before Bill's question. When I was 15 years old, summer of '84, I spent a month in West Germany, a country which, of course, no longer exists, and we did a day trip from West Berlin into East Berlin, and you had to exchange. They forced you to do this at the checkpoint. 25 perfectly good West German marks for 25 worthless East German marks, and you had to spend them there in East Berlin. You weren't allowed to bring anything back with you. Now, at the time, 25 West German marks was about $10, and the unofficial exchange rate was about 3 to 1 East to West marks. So I was really getting about $3.30 to spend in East Berlin. And having spent a day there, I couldn't spend all my money. We had to talk the border guards into letting us bring the money back or leaving it with them because there was nothing to buy. I couldn't spend $3 a day. And East Berlin was the wealthiest city in the wealthiest socialist country that has ever existed.
The greatest thing ever said about communism is that communism could make poor people out of Germans. And I think that's absolutely right.
It could make Germans make Trabants.
I will say that if there are any New York cabbies watching this show, when Bill Whittle was talking, they were going, a cab medallion for only $3,000 a month? Not bad.
Yeah, well, welcome to New York City, comrades.
But you can earn a little bit more money driving a cab in New York than you can in Havana. You know, what it made me think of when I saw this Hannah Dryer's story, and she does this interview that I think is very genuine. And I'm like Steve, I'm not going to smack her down for her idealism going in. And I think her eyes were open in the course of doing things, and she got to feel the real impact of what was happening there. I haven't read all of her stories, so I don't know, per Bill's question, whether she accurately said, hey, these are the consequences of socialism. I think it is more likely that she credited that to the Maduro dictatorship than she did to the actual ideology itself. But what it made me think is, think of how many reporters we have in the United States of America packing into the White House briefing room, crowding into governors' mansions and cluttering up the hallways on Capitol Hill, reporting about the essentially trivia that happens on a day-to-day basis, when they could be in places like Venezuela, documenting the downfall of civilization at the hands of tyrants and fools. I hope one journalist is watching this show now and says, you know what, maybe I need to buy a plane ticket and go somewhere where I can see the impact of decisions that really affect people's lives and maybe be part of a clarion call to reverse that inevitable slide when you step into socialism and destroy the dignity of human beings. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching Right Angle. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making it possible.